If you were here last week, and for those of you who weren't, God told Moses at the end of his life, before he was going to die, and the people of Israel were going to go into the promised land, that before they did, Moses was supposed to write a song for them. And that this song was going to be one that they would sing over and over and over again. And it was supposed to be a reminder to them. God had, throughout the course of their existence, been very careful to remind them again and again and again of what he had done for them, how much he had provided them for them, how much he really had sort of propped them up and carried them along. And as we're going to see in this song how he calls attention to the fact that really they didn't even exist before he called them. And in all of this, all that he had done for them was a clear indication of what he was capable of doing. Now, how did I know that these piranha that I had in this tank could have easily bitten little chunks of flesh off my hands? Well, I've seen YouTube videos now. There wasn't YouTube back then, but there certainly was lots of books about them. And not only that, is I had fed them quite a few exotic meats, fish, shrimp, things like that, and saw with my own eyes what they were very capable of doing within a matter of seconds. So, I had this experience. So did the Israelites. They had experience after experience after experience of what God could do. And yet, as we see, they did not have that holy reverence for him. They did not have that fear of him. They did not have that sense that we need to do what he tells us to do. Not only because of what he has done, but because of what he has promised if we don't. And so, as we look at this song of Moses, it's really a song that I imagine answering a series of rhetorical questions. Questions that highlight the goodness of God, questions that highlight the foolishness of Israel, questions that highlight the justice of God's judgment, and also, as we see at the very end, questions that highlight the hope for the future. In this song, we see that how God deals with Israel's rebellion is actually proof that he alone is holy. His response is a demonstration of his nature and his character. And so as we look at this song together this morning, a lot of it focuses on what Israel had done. But really, that simply is there to serve as the platform, really, for Israel to be reminded again and again and again that they serve or should serve a holy God. This is a long chapter, 52 verses. And believe it or not, we're going to do our best to get through them all this morning. I'm hoping less than 3 hours. So, before we get into, most of the chapter is the song. But that's what we're going to focus on. But there are two sections that come at the very end of the chapter. I'm going to deal with them first, and then we'll go back to the song. So go all the way to the end of Deuteronomy chapter 32. Go to verse 48. That very day the Lord spoke to Moses, "Go up this mountain of Abram, Mount Nebo, which is in the land of Moab, opposite Jericho, and view the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel for a possession. And die on the mountain which you go up, and be gathered to your people, as Aaron your brother died on Mount Hor, and was gathered to his people, because you broke faith with me in the midst of the people of Israel at the waters of Meribah Kadesh, in the wilderness of Zin, and because you did not treat me as holy in the midst of the people of Israel. For you shall see the land before you, but you shall not go there into the land that I am giving you to the people of Israel to possess. So, Moses is we've already mentioned from last chapter, he's 120 years old. He is at the end of his life, and God is preparing both him and the people of Israel for his soon coming death. But one thing that he gives Moses as sort of a gift before he dies is that he has him ascend to the top of this mountain so he can look out from that mountain peak across into the land that God had promised to his people, going all the way back to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. So he is given this sort of one last gift, that even though he's not allowed to go into the land because some of the sins that he committed while the people of Israel were wandering in the wilderness, he is allowed to sort of look out into that land and see that it is in fact there, and to know what God is going to give to the people. And then the section just prior to that begins in verse 45. And when Moses had finished speaking all these words to all Israel, he said to them, "Take to heart all the words by which I am warning you today, that you may command them to your children, that they may be careful to do all the words of this law. For it is no empty word for you, for your very life, but your very life. And by this word you shall live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to possess." So almost sort of a exclamation point. At the end of this song, Moses challenges the people, hey, this is not just a song for you to sing. This is not just something for you to do to be sort of included in the canon of your traditions. This is a word from God to you. It has meaning. It has significance. If you listen to it and you take it to heart, you will be blessed. You will live long in the land. But if you disregard it, if you ignore it, if you cast it aside, you will pay the consequences for ignoring it. Don't take this lightly. So, let's look at this song together. As I mentioned, I imagine it as the answer to a series of rhetorical questions. The first question being, what were they thinking? What were these people thinking? Verses 1 through 14. "Give ear, O heavens, and I will speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. May my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as dew, like gentle rain upon the tender grass, and like showers upon the herb. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without iniquity, just and upright is he. They have dealt corruptly with him. They are no longer his children because they are blemished. They are a crooked and twisted generation. Do you thus repay the Lord, you foolish and senseless people? Is he not your Father who created you, who made you and established you? Remember the days of old. Consider the years of many generations. Ask your father, and he will show you, your elders, and they will tell you. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the people, according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is his allotted heritage. He found him in a desert land and in the howling wastes of the wilderness. He encircled him. He cared for him. He kept him as the apple of his eye. Like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that flutters over its young, spreading out its wings, catching them, bearing them on its pinions. The Lord alone guided him. No foreign god was with him. He made him ride on the high places of the land, and he ate the produce of the field. He suckled him with honey out of the rock and oil out of the flinty rock, curds from the herd and milk from the flock, with fat of lambs, rams of Bashan, and goats, with the very finest of the wheat. And you drank foaming wine made from the blood of the grape. Imagine reading these words almost with a twinge of pain in your voice. That's how I imagine Moses as he is delivering this song for the first time to these people and setting up this contrast, painting this picture of Israel, of the good God who loved them and called them and blessed them. A God who, as we mentioned from Jude, is worthy to be ascribed greatness. He calls him the rock. Throughout this song, again and again and again, God is called the rock. This idea of permanence, this idea that he is unmoving, as if the ocean could crash against him for 1,000 years and he would still be there. He is the rock. Moses calls him perfect, says that he is just in all his ways, that he is faithful, that he is without iniquity. In other words, he does no wrong. He is upright. The image that Moses paints for us, paints for the Israelites at the beginning of the song, is almost as if you could design a God for yourself, you could not design a better one, because this God is perfect. He cannot be improved upon. So, when you come to verse 5 and you read, they have dealt corruptly with him, it is almost as if there's an anticipation of an audible gasp. How could anyone deal corruptly with a God so perfect as this one? With a God who has done so much? Why would Israel deal with a God who is perfect, just, faithful, and upright? It doesn't make any sense. We have this contrast of a great God and a foolish people. Moses said that this perfect God established them. They did not exist. He birthed them. He made them. They owe their very existence to him. But they have rejected him. They, according to the picture that Moses paints in this psalm, literally were nothing without him. They owe their very existence to him. More than that, in this sort of beautiful picture painted in verses 8 and 9, he says that when God gave to the nations their inheritance, he divided them up and gave them lands and borders. But to this special people, he was their God. They were his portion. They belonged to him. They were his heritage. It's as if you are sort of, you've got your big basket of Halloween candy, and you're going to divide it up among you and your siblings. These are the pieces, though, that you keep for yourself. Israel was the nation that God kept for himself. Hear the pain as Moses describes all that God had done for them. He found them in the desert. He protected them and made them something that he cherished. He cared about them like a mother eagle. He alone guided them. None of these other gods participated in any of this. He brought them to good lands. He more than just sustained them, he blessed them with abundance. He fed them with the sweetest, most succulent foods and drink that life on earth had to offer. So this is the picture. A perfect God found, or really birthed and blessed a people who were nobody and who had nothing, and they, in response, respond corruptly and rebelliously towards him. So, the question really is, I think, appropriate. What were they thinking? It doesn't make, on the surface, we would say it doesn't make any sense, right? But we all sin. We all sin and instantly regret it, and then the next day do the same thing again, don't we? So it's easy for us to say, for those people, what were they thinking? But yet, we sort of engage in the same hypocrisy as well, the same foolishness. Verses 15 to 19, the question is, what have you done? But Jeshurun grew fat and kicked. You grew fat, stout, and sleek. Then he forsook God who made him and scoffed at the rock of his salvation. They stirred him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominations. They provoked him to anger. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, to gods that they had never known, to new gods that had come recently, whom your fathers had never dreamed. You were unmindful of the rock that bore you. You forgot the God who gave you birth. The Lord saw it and spurned them because of the provocations of his sons and daughters. Jeshurun, in verse 15, is sort of a pet name for Israel. It means upright, and it's used to depict Israel as this holy people of God. Here it's used sort of ironically. These people that are called to be holy, called to be set apart, called to be different from everyone else, prove to be anything but upright. You read how they treated God and how they rejected him in favor of all these other idols and deities of the nations that surrounded them, and you might think, well, they're not upright. They're low-down, dirty dogs. They're doing things that are sort of abominable. God, who was a rock to them, would be sort of kicked aside like a pebble. And instead, these worthless idols of the nation would be worshipped in his place. The idea that they had never known them, these were gods who had come recently, your fathers never dreaded these gods. The idea is that they couldn't possibly be the deities that helped you through all of the trials and difficulties through which you have been carried along, through which you have been provided for, through which you have been protected. They couldn't be the gods that did that because you never even heard of these gods before you got here. You didn't even know they existed. They were gods who had done nothing and would do nothing because they were incapable of doing anything for Israel or for anyone else, because as God makes clear here, they literally are nothing. They are gods in your mind only. And so, Israel, God's people, by turning from him to worship these other gods, would provoke him to jealousy and anger. One of God's attributes that we would associate with a description like the rock is the attribute that we call immutability. Now, the idea behind immutability, it means that since God is perfect, he is incapable of change. By definition, he cannot change. He cannot change to improve himself because he's already perfect, and he cannot change to diminish or degrade himself because he is perfect. So when we hear of responses that God has towards their actions, like jealousy or like anger, we might think that that would interfere with God's immutability. Somehow that would communicate to us some sort of negative or positive change, however you look at it. But let's first let's look at some definitions of these things. This is how jealousy is described in the systematic theology book written by John MacArthur and Richard Mayhew. They say God's jealousy is his zealous protectiveness of all that belongs to him, himself, his name, his glory, his people, etc. So because God is perfect and all glory and honor and praise are rightly due to him, any violation of that or any turning of that worship, or glory, adoration, or praise to anything else should justly receive some sort of negative response from this perfect God. Carl Henry says this: in the New Testament, no less than the Old, the word group of the terms pertaining to divine anger serves to define the immutable character of God. This does not interfere with his immutability. This is a part of him that is unchanging. He will always respond to rebellion towards him. He will always respond to sinful actions towards him with a holy, righteous anger. These responses do not contradict his immutability, they define it. Because he is perfect in every way, that's what we mean when we say he is holy, any insult to that holiness must be responded to it with a proportionately negative way, or God's perfection would be undermined. God cannot just turn a blind eye to sin and still be considered holy. He has to deal with it, even if the sin is from his own people that he has built up and loved and cared for and provided for. So when we ask, what have they done? They have turned away from him, and in doing so, they have provoked his jealousy and anger. So how will God respond? How's God going to respond to that? Let's pick back up and read 19 again. The Lord saw it and spurned them because of the provocation of his sons and his daughters. And he said, I will hide my face from them. I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faithfulness. They have made me jealous with what is no God. They have provoked me to anger with their idols. So I will make them jealous with those who are no people. I will provoke them to anger with a foolish nation. For a fire is kindled by my anger, and it burns to the depths of Sheol, devours the earth and its increase, and sets the fire of the foundations of the mountains. And I will heap disasters upon them, and I will spend my arrows on them. They shall be wasted with hunger and devoured by plague and poisonous pestilence. I will send the teeth of beasts against them, with venom of things that crawl in the dust. Outdoors the sword shall bereave, and indoors terror. For young man and woman alike, the nursing child with the man of gray hairs. I would have said, I will cut them to pieces, I will wipe them from human memory, had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord who did all this. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. So how will God respond? It won't be good, at least not from Israel's perspective. He says he will hide his face from them. He will make them jealous. He will provoke them to anger. He will heap disasters on them. He will spend his arrows on them. He will send the teeth of beast against them. Notice in verse 21, there's a sort of a clever word play. They have made me jealous with what is no God, so I will make them jealous with those who are no people. God will give them what they want. They, turning to the gods of the nations around them, will find themselves overrun and overcome by those same nations. In other words, what they get is just like what Paul mentions in Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, where he is talking about people who are in the hardness of their hearts, rebelling against God. Part of the judgment against them is that God is going to give them over to their debased mind, to their depraved desires. They are going to be given over to them. In other words, as a part of God's judgment against them, they're going to get what they want. Their sinful desire is the same as the judgment. God's response is consistent with his holy character. He will do as he promised he would do. Turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Deuteronomy chapter 5 is where we have Moses going over the 10 Commandments again. First got them in Exodus, and here he goes over them again. And if we pick up in verse 6, I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourselves a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord, am your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generations to those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. God had promised them, if they have other gods before him, if they worship other things besides him, if they create idols and worship those idols, if they do that, there will be a proportionate negative response. They will fall under his condemnation. Theodorus Vriesen, you guys read him all the time, right? He's a Dutch Old Testament scholar from the 19th century. He says this: according to the prophets, the worst of all is that in their wicked self-conceit, men say that God cannot be angry. It's sort of the worst self-delusion we could have. God is so good. God is so loving. God is so whatever. He couldn't possibly be angry with me. I can do whatever I want. He won't care. No doubt this is in part what perhaps led Israel to abandon God to begin with. Surely he would never do that to us. Look at how wonderful we are. How could anyone be mad at us? In spite of all that they had seen God do to Israel's enemies, they somehow convinced themselves that he wouldn't do the same thing to them if they followed the same path of Israel's enemies. This is what so many today have convinced themselves to be true about God. I can do whatever I want because God would never be angry with me. God would never have a proportionately negative response to my sinful actions, so I can do whatever I want. God will respond in proportion to the wickedness of their rebellion against him. And what will the people learn from all this? Let's turn back to Deuteronomy chapter 32. What will they learn? Verse 28. For they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. If they were wise, they would understand this. They would discern their latter end. How could one have chased 1,000 and two have put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them, and the Lord had given them up? For their rock is not as our rock. Our enemies are by themselves. For their vine comes from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison. Their clusters are bitter. Their wine is the poison of serpents and the cruel venom of asps. Is not this laid up in the store with me, sealed up in my treasuries? Vengeance is mine, and recompense for the time when their foot shall slip. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and their doom comes swiftly. Israel, interestingly enough, there's not agreement at all about whether this passage refers to Israel or Israel's enemies, the ones God has used as instruments of their destruction. I mean, it doesn't matter if you can go back hundreds, in some cases even thousands of years, to Jewish scholars, medieval scholars, Reformation scholars. It doesn't matter. Everybody has come down on different sides of the issue as to whether or not this portion of the psalm refers to Israel or to Israel's enemies. Whoever it is, they won't learn anything. They are foolish. They don't get it. They don't understand. They will fail to understand that the only reason they had any success at all was due to God using them. In this case, using them as instruments of judgment on Israel's rebellion. I think this refers to Israel's enemies, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the nations that God used to punish Israel. I conclude this is a reference to Israel's enemies for 4 reasons. Number 1, God had restrained his hand of judgment on Israel so that her enemies don't misunderstand. They don't understand how God operates. Not that they don't understand, so that they do misunderstand. They don't understand how God operates because he had restrained his hand of judgment on them. This is leading up to it. Verse 27. Had I not feared provocation by the enemy, lest their adversaries should misunderstand, lest they should say, our hand is triumphant. It was not the Lord who did all this. This is the only reason why God says he doesn't completely destroy them. Was because then whether it's the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Philistines, whoever would think this has nothing to do with God, it has everything to do with me. So he's talking about this misunderstanding that these oppressors have. Then he says in verse 28, they are a nation void of counsel, and there is no understanding in them. It seems strange to shift, talking about this misunderstanding, this failure to realize what is going on, to then sort of shift back to talking about Israel. Number 2, they chased because God had given Israel up. Verse 30. How could one have chased 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight unless their rock, that is the rock, had sold them and the Lord given them up? The only reason they had any victory, the only reason they were able to defeat them so easily, was because the God who had sustained, provided for, and protected Israel for so long had given them over to this judgment. They don't understand that. They think it's because they're so powerful, because they're so strong. And then he says this, their rock is not as our rock. Verse 31. Your translations might even have the first rock lowercase and the second rock uppercase. Their support, their source of strength, what they depend on, does not compare to the one true rock. And then he says, vengeance is mine. Even though God is using them for this end, that is to bring judgment on his disobedient people, he still will avenge his people. It doesn't justify what the Babylonians did, what the Assyrians did, what any of the nations that attempted to oppress God's people did. That was still wrong. He's still going to avenge that. He's still going to bring justice in that situation. So these people, the instruments that God is going to use to judge his people, they are not going to get it. They're not going to realize that the only way that they can have success is if God permits them to, so that his purpose of bringing judgment to his people for their rebellion could be served. Which leads us to sort of the final rhetorical question, and that is, if God's going to use these nations to judge Israel for going after the gods of these nations, both of them are going to experience God's justice and judgment. Is there any hope? Is there any hope in all of this? Verses 36 to 43. For the Lord will vindicate his people and have compassion on his servants. When he sees that their power is gone and there is none remaining bond or free, then he will say, where are their gods, the rock in which they took refuge, who ate the fat of their sacrifices and drank the wine of their drink offerings? Let them rise up to help you. Let them be your protection. See now that I, even I, am he, and there is no God beside me. I kill and make alive, I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. For I lift up my hand to heaven and swear, as I live forever, if I sharpen my flashing sword and my hand takes hold on judgment, I will take vengeance on my adversaries, and I will repay those who hate me. I will make my arrows drunk with blood, and my sword shall devour flesh, with the blood of the slain and the captives from the long-haired heads of the enemy. Rejoice with him, O heavens. Bow down to him, all gods, for he avenges the blood of his children and takes vengeance on his adversaries. He repays those who hate him and cleanses his people's land. Moses came and recited all the words of this song in the hearing of the people, he and Joshua, the son of Nun. There is hope. There is always hope. More than hope, there's a promise. There's a promise that God made to Abraham long ago, that God would avenge his people because he had promised to Abraham that all those who bless you will be blessed and those who curse you will be cursed. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, anyone else who fought against Israel would experience God's vengeance. Not only that, at the very end, the very last phrase of this sentence is that he not only will repay those who hate him, but he cleanses his people's land. He would do this by cleansing the people. He would do this through the blood of Christ. He would do this through the blood of the new covenant. Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 30 and 31 say this: when you are in tribulation, and all these things come upon you in the latter days, you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. For the Lord your God is merciful. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. Before he even laid out all the commandments in this book of the law in Deuteronomy, beginning in chapter 5, in chapter 4, Moses said, look, you're going to rebel. These things are going to happen, and as a result of your rebellion against God, you're going to experience great tribulation. All this bad stuff that God has promised to those who turn their backs on him and reject his commandments, you're going to experience that. But you will return to the Lord your God and obey his voice. Not because all of a sudden you in and of yourselves are like, you know what? We've made a huge mistake. That's not the reason. The reason is because God is merciful. He will not leave you or destroy you or forget the covenant with your fathers that he swore to them. God will, as we've seen again and again, God's going to be the one that turns their hearts back to him. God's going to be the one who regenerates their hearts, who transforms unbelieving hearts into believing hearts. And not just as we come to the New Testament, we see this new covenant isn't just for the Israelites, it's for the Jews and the Gentiles. The same covenant for both of them. Did you ever feel hopeless? I imagine there's a lot of days where for many different reasons you feel hopeless. I know I do. I mean, I wondered, is any of this stuff ever going to get any better? Is any of this stuff ever going to change? Maybe it feels like God's turned his face away. Maybe it feels like we're experiencing some of the consequences of rebellion against God, worshiping other idols. It's comforting to know, though, no matter how hopeless it seems, that we have example after example after example of how far God is willing to go to keep his covenants, to fulfilling his promises. Think of the promises that he has made in Scripture. Promises of redemption, promises of salvation, promises of renewal, promises of restoration, promises to complete the work he has begun in us, promises of Christ's return, promises of a renewed creation, promises of the end of sin and death, all manner of wonderful promises. It is so comforting to know that in spite of the fact that when we look around, we see the consequences of a world under the curse of sin all around us, we still know that that will one day come to an end. Because God is perfect, and he has promised to see the redemption of sinners and the renewal of his creation under the righteous reign of Jesus Christ. He's promised to see all that to completion. And so one day, the book of Revelation tells us that one day we're all going to sing the song of Moses. We're going to be reminded of God's holiness in judging sin, but also his faithfulness in completing his promises in spite of our sinfulness. He is going to make it happen because he is a merciful God and he will not forget his covenants. Let's pray. Dear Lord, we thank you so much for this song that Moses was faithful to write. I imagine it was very painful to him, being at the end of his life, maybe feeling, if not hopeless, maybe feeling helpless to keep the people from falling headlong into the foolishness of sin and rebellion against God, and yet still having this promise at the end of a cleansed land through a cleansed people. God would be merciful to them and would not utterly destroy them, in spite of the fact that that is what all who rebel against you deserve. We deserve to experience the full weight of the consequences of our actions. And yet you're merciful and you're gracious. You are compassionate. You're forgiving. And you have provided a way through the blood of the new covenant, through Jesus Christ and his sacrifice, for us to be redeemed from our sins, to have our hearts renewed, and to be made right with you, not because of our efforts or our good works, but because of the work of your Son, Jesus Christ. We understand it's all a part of your fulfilling your promises that you made really all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. And we thank you for that. We ask that you would help us to hang on to that as a hope, that you are the rock that we can depend on, and that all your promises are true.